Hi folks, I am recording the part 2 demo of the Grime art project, and this is about where we should have left off in the last demo. We talked about making our outlines around the face and facial features as well as the drips, all using our brush tool in black, and then locking that. We should have our duplicate and original versions of the portrait photo in the background also locked. We made our skin color and then we used those same techniques to add color to details like the eyes, eyebrows, lips, if you have this under eye area, anything like that. So now we've got to talk about adding realistic or as realistic as possible highlights and shadows to the face and the drips. So how we do that, we are always going to start with a new blank layer for anything that we add. And we're going to start with the face shadows. So I'm going to rename this layer just that, face shadows. Enter, and I'm going to drag it just below the outline. And actually below all these other facial features too, because if I do a shadow that borders the eyebrow color or the under eye, I want the shadow to show up underneath those, meaning I don't want my shadow to color over the eyebrow or any other of those details. I do want it to show up above the skin color though, because I want the shadow to take the place of or show up on top of the regular base skin color. So I'm actually going to hide all my other layers, including my outlines and skin color, except the only thing that I should be able to see is one of my photo layers and my face shadow layer. So I'm going to make sure that I'm on my face shadows and I've got my brush tool selected. I want to make sure I keep an eye on my brush size, but it's not crucial because we'll be filling these areas in. And what you're going to do for this part as best you can, you're going to outline the shadows you see on the face in complete filled in shapes. So don't do like an opening like that. You want to complete the shadows so that you start back where you began with your brush outline. Some things to keep in mind though that you always want to check before you really start working on this project. You need to make sure that the hardness of your brush is set to 100%. So you go up here to your brush presets and drag that slider all the way to the right for hardness. And check to make sure the color of your brush is the color that you're going to want your shadows. It'll just make life a little easier. So I'm going to quickly turn on skin color to decide my face shadow color. So I'm going to click I to get my eyedropper, suck up the base skin color, and look over here in my color panel, which should be on the right for you if you have reset your essentials workspace. So I sucked up my regular skin color, and I'm going to pick a color that's just barely darker than that, not by much. I don't want it to be really drastic and high contrast, but I do want the face shadows to add a little bit of depth by being a little darker than the regular skin tone. So I use my eyedropper to suck up the base skin color, and then I use this color picker to choose a color that's just a little more saturated and a little bit darker than that regular skin color. So I'm going to go back to hiding my skin color layer now that I've got the color I want, and I'm going to get my brush tool. And on the face shadows layer, I'm just going to start to outline these areas of shadow. And I can see that there's shadow kind of under her eye area here, and kind of curving along the cheek and where her fingers touch her face, and then kind of along the bottom of the chin to about here. And I know I'm going outside of the edge of her face. That's okay. I can clean this up later with the eraser. I'm just trying to pay careful attention to the edge of that shadow. I also see a little bit of a shadow area here along the side of the nose. And underneath her nose is one area too. And I'm just outlining again like these major areas of shadow. I'm not being super picky, but trying to get these basic spots outlined. That one a little on the edge there. I don't like how that went, so I'm just going to come up and add that shadow here. I also see these shadows under her eyebrows and along the eye socket in here. And you can test this out to see how it goes for you. You might need to experiment, do it a couple times till you get it right or till it looks the way you want. But really, we're just trying to outline the major shadows on the face as best you can, because these are going to be what gives the face depth later. See these little pockets of shadows where her lips are kind of pursed, and this shadow underneath. There. So I know it looks a little bit weird, but this is going to help give the face some depth. So I'm going to do this part first, and then I'll do the neck, and then we can do even darker shadows if we want. So I'm going to just outline pretty much most of the neck like this as well. And just notice that all of these areas of shadow are contained. So I don't have any open areas like that where there's an opening. Because if I go to paint this in, the color is going to bleed out and color the entire layer instead of just inside the shadows where you want. Now I'm going to get my paint bucket tool, which remember, if you've reset the Photoshop settings file, all your tools go back to default and you'll have to find the paint bucket tool under your gradient. So I've got my my paint bucket tool. And with this color still enabled that I chose, I'm just going to paint in these areas. Now, one annoying thing you'll notice is like when you paint an area in, there's still this tiny little border left between them. You can either get your brush and go over those by hand, which is kind of like a pain in the butt process, or just get your paint bucket and click a second time. I don't know why it does this or how exactly to fix it, and I honestly should look further into it, but it just seems like the second time it kind of catches all those little pixelated areas that don't absorb the color the first time around. So it looks weird, but then let's turn on all our other layers too. And you can already see with the light and the dark color of the skin how it's starting to give her face more dimension as we turn on these other bits. And then finally the outlines, it actually really helps, I think, the shape of the face become more apparent and less flat. You can see that I went over the edges though, so I'm going to grab my eraser, make sure that I'm still on the face shadow layer, and I'm going to just either by hand or using the connect the dots method, go through and just clean up whatever is showing outside of the edge of my outlines. That's what's nice about having those outlines there, is you get a little bit of wiggle room for if you go outside of the edges, and you don't have to be quite so precise in that respect. Clean up these parts. Here. Oh, a little too far, so I'm going to undo that part, make my brush smaller, and keep cleaning these up. All right, so the next thing I want to show you just really quickly is if you have an area of a much darker shadow and you really want that to be part of your face shadows, like her neck has a much darker shadow under here. I'll show you how to do that. It's up to you how many kind of like layers of shadow you want. Right now I just have the base skin tone and just kind of one light shadow to give the face dimension. But if you remember, like if I hide all these other things, there's that particularly dark shadow here under her neck. So I'm just going to try out adding one more layer of face shadow. I'm just going to call this face shadow 2. In parentheses, just for my own information, I'm going to put darker. It's really the labels on your layers, like the names of your layers, are to help me understand what I'm looking at if I come over to help you or when you turn your work in, but it's also for you to understand what you've got on each layer. So make sure whatever you're naming them that it's descriptive and easy for you to tell what's where. So I'm going to go back in on this layer. I'm going to make this first face shadow layer available because I want to pick up that color and choose one again that's just slightly darker and a little more, saturated. So I'm going to hide that again because I want to be able to see my original photo to tell where those particularly dark shadows are. I've got my paintbrush again, and I'm just going to kind of come in and outline those areas of particularly dark shadows. And again, you're going to have to be simplifying this. So don't worry about getting it just perfect based on the photo, because again, the whole point of this is to be kind of like a simplified graphic version of all this stuff. So I don't know if these dark shadows will even show under my outline because my outline does come into the face pretty far, but I'm going to try it. So same thing, get my paint bucket, fill in these darker shadows with that other color. If there are any difficult to reach areas, you can always just use your paintbrush tool. Like that little spot there might just be easier for me to do with the paintbrush. Same little spot. Okay, so now to make sure it's all cleaned up, I'm going to turn all these other layers on, and it helps bring in a little bit more depth. So that third layer of shadow is totally optional. I'm going to recommend that everybody do at least one layer of face shadows, like just one slightly darker color than your regular skin tone, but you do not have to go, 3 layers deep into your shadows. Just for people that want a little bit more realism, even though this is a very unreal kind of effect that we're applying, that's one way to make your portrait look a little less flat and a little bit more dimensional. Okay, so I'm just cleaning up again where it goes outside of these outlines. A little too far there. Cool. Okay, so now I have those 3 layers of shadows. It really helps to add dimension to the face. I forgot to add that slightly little bit of darker shadow on the nose, so I'm going to quickly do that. I've got my eyedropper sucking up that color I used there. Got my brush, and I'm on my darker face shadows layer, and I'm just going to kind of quickly reference the shadows on the nose here. It's really just her nostrils, and I want to add that little bit of extra dark shadow too. So again, these are just the little tiny touches that help to make your portrait look more realistic and a little bit more detail. Cool. So now we're ready to start talking about the highlights and shadows. I mean, in a perfect world, I would do these same shadows on the hand too, but I don't want this to be like a 10-hour tutorial just watching me fill in color, so you get the idea. Next, what I'm going to do is talk to you about the shadows and then the highlights on each of our drips. So since we're going to be adding new colors, that will require some new layers. So I'm going to make a new blank layer. I'm going to call it drip shadows. Excuse me. And I want these to show up on top of the skin colors and the skin shadows. And if you have them above your facial feature, colors or not, that's up to you. So I've got my drip shadows layer selected. Got my brush, although I need to pick the color of my drip shadow. So I'm probably going to make my drip shadows the darker of the two that I used on the face shadows. If you didn't use these 2 layers of shadow, you would probably just want to pick one that's slightly darker than your regular face shadow, because the idea is that under these drips, it's really blocking the light because the dimension of these imaginary drips is coming off the face, but there's going to be, it's called an occlusion shadow right underneath, shapes that create shadows or objects that create shadows. There's a spot where no light is going to get to, and we're kind of trying to simulate that slightly darker shadow under an object that's blocking the light. So we've got, I've picked up my darker of the 2 shadow colors. I've got my brush, and you're going to need to make these shadows correspond with the direction that light is coming from for your subject. So if I hide all of these, it's kind of difficult to tell, but you're going to have to look closely at your photo and figure out what direction is the light source coming from. And if you can't tell, or if you have a really soft, diffuse day that you were photographing, the light is pretty even, or you don't have any direct, like directional shadows on your face, you're going to either have to choose or make it up. For me, since I'm seeing the shadows kind of underneath the fingers like this, and this side of her face is more in shadow, that to me tells me that the light is coming from this direction. If this is the sun shining down on her, so cute. The harsher shadows that I'm seeing are on this side of the face, being blocked by the hair and the hands, and right here as well. Again, it's kind of hard to tell because it was a pretty overcast day when this photo was taken, so it's not super, super clear, but you just need to do your best to kind of look at the face, figure out what parts of it are in shadow, where the light's coming from, and how you can use that to make the lighting on these imaginary parts of your illustration look realistic and consistent. I'll show you the shadows and how they would look depending on whatever the light source for your photo is. And if, of course, if you still have questions, you can always ask, and I'll come over and try and help you evaluate too. So I'm back to my drip shadows layer. I'm going to assume that my light source is coming from this direction. So that means my shadows are going to be on this side of all the drips, on the right side, the opposite side of my light source. So I'm going to zoom in on some of these drips. So I'm going to start up here at the top. You're going to want your brush size to be a little bit thicker than the size you use to outline your drips, but not so much that it's just totally overpowering and clunky on the face. So I'm going to start with this strip. So I know I want my shadow to be on the right side of each of my drips. And I'm just going to start and kind of try to curve into my drip at the bottom there. So you don't want to have a really clunky end, like a really abrupt, like that's too clunky and not really natural looking. So try and curve into your drip at the bottom if you can. You can always use your eraser to clean this up or use a smaller brush size if that's difficult for you. Like, and you can use your left and right bracket to change your brush size on the go too, so don't forget that. I'm going to add a little shadow here. If you have these top lines, you might have to kind of figure out how you want the light and shadow to affect those because that's kind of a new thing for me to try style-wise. And I haven't quite figured out what's the most realistic way to do the light on those. But for each drip, I'm just doing a shadow on the right side of whatever the lowest part of the drip is. So like here, this is the lowest part of the drip. So I'm going to do a shadow along the right side here and kind of curve it in at the end like that. And then it comes back down here. So I'm going to go along the right side until I hit the apex of that drip. And the idea is that you're just making a little shadow on the opposite side of where the light source is coming from, which is this direction. It's important that you're consistent with this. So what you don't want to do is like, you know, some drips on the right and then some where you have the whole thing outlined like this, and then some where you have the left side outlined because it's going to look like the light is coming from all different directions. And that's going to be really confusing and not make your piece look consistent if you have drips coming from every different direction, different points in the face. So the most important part, whatever lighting you identify for your portrait, is that you're consistent. And here's an area where I went a little too far over the edge, so I can just grab my eraser, use my left bracket to make it smaller, and just clean up that little bit that's showing. So I'm just being consistent and going along the right edge of the lowest part of each of my drips. These little top parts are kind of a different animal, so do what you can with those. And I'll just do a few more as an example, and then we can talk about highlights. So again, I'm trying to make the bottom curve in gently to the rest of the drip and not just end it like this, because that abrupt of an ending again kind of ruins the illusion because that's not really how shadows look. And again, if you go over the edge or, you know, it does look abrupt, you can grab your eraser to kind of clean up those shadows. All right. So again, the idea is just to follow along the edge on the opposite side of each of your drips from where the light is coming from. And I have identified one thing that gets a little bit tricky. If your shadow goes over an object of another color, so like here I have a drip going over my eyebrow, to really, really nail this look, I know it's going to be like extra bunch of steps for just such a minor detail, but it will help. I'm going to do Shift Control N to make a new layer. I'm going to call this eyebrow shadow. It's right above my drip shadow, and I'm going to do the same thing, but just for that one little part. So I'm going to eyedrop my eyebrow color, choose a slightly darker version of that, get my brush, and on my eyebrow shadow layer, I'm just going to come in. Oh, I got to make sure it's above my eyebrows though. So let me do that. So I'm going to pick up where my shadow here leaves off. And if I went over the edge of the outline of my eyebrow, I can just get my eraser and get rid of that. But see how that really helps to carry the shadow across the eyebrow without it being a purple shadow on a yellow eyebrow, because the idea is when you block the light from different parts of the face, it's the same basic color, there's just less light illuminating that color. So that's the idea there. I also noticed there's a little shadow that goes into my drip, so I'm going to clean that up quickly with my eraser. Okay. So now we're ready to talk about, it's on my drip shadow layer. Cool. Now we're ready to talk about highlights that now that we have this area done. And again, this is going to be different for each of your photos depending on where your light source is. So as long as you know where the light's coming from, the shadows are on the opposite side, and just be consistent. If you're confused, like I said, I'll help you, just holler at me. Okay, so we've got our shadows. Now we're going to make a highlight layer. So drip highlights. And this layer also should be above your regular face color, um, probably above your shadows, but still below your outlines layer. So my outlines are here on top. it doesn't matter if your highlights are above or below the facial feature colors like the lips and eyebrows and stuff. Okay, so for this same basic beginning steps, I'm going to get my eyedropper. I drop the regular skin color, but since it's a highlight, I want it to be a little bit brighter than the regular skin color. So in my color picker, I'm going to pick one over towards the left where the white is. I don't want to go full white because I still want it to be just a lighter version of the color on the skin, but I want it to be brighter and brighter enough so that it still stands out from the skin. So I'm going to click over to the left so it's a lighter shade of purple, then get my brush. And same idea with the shadows, but we're doing this on the opposite side now. So since the light source we identified was coming from the left, we knew that we wanted the shadows on the opposite side because when light shines on an object, the other side is what's, the light is being blocked from. But now that we're doing highlights, that's where the light is hitting your drips. So for me, since I've identified or just decided that my light source is coming from the left, I want my highlights to be on the left. So I'm going to just come along the very edge of, each apex of my drip, do the same exact thing where I just do a gradual little sliver of highlight just until the bottom. So like from the highest part of my drip to the lowest part, but I'm not going back up again because you don't want the whole thing to be outlined in highlight. The idea is that just a little bit of light is catching the edge of this drip. Outlining the whole thing makes it look like the light is coming from everywhere and hitting the whole edge of your drip, which just isn't realistic. A highlight usually is just on a small part of a drip. So for me, I'm going to do maybe like that left side or even less than that, just these little parts that would be facing where my light source is. So just the very leftmost edge of each of my drips. And for these little top guys, if you have any of those, I imagine the light might hit, a little bit on this edge. Again, using my eraser to clean up if I go outside the lines. So a couple more examples. My highlight's just going to be hitting like this left side of that drip, and then this left side here, and a little bit on the edge like that. Cleaning up. And I don't want the highlight to go all the way that far on this top piece because actually I want the highlight to be on this side because this is the side of this little top drip, at least in my imagination, where the light is coming from. It's hitting that top side of the weird part of the drip. So you might have to take some creative license. You might have to kind of like fudge it a little bit, but as long as you're consistent, just try and have your highlights be facing the direction of your light source and take it one drip at a time. And even like within a drip, like this drip has multiple parts, but there's 1, 2 major like, lower apexes, I guess, or whatever the lowest part of a drip is called. And I'm just doing my highlights along the edges of those lower parts. So every time your drip changes direction, you're probably going to have a new highlight and shadow with that part. And it might look weird at first, but just try it on several drips and then zoom out and kind of look at it from further away, and you'll hopefully get the feel that it's giving your piece a little bit more dimension than it had before. Because that's the whole point, is that like these drips aren't real and we have to make them look real by how we use light and shadow to kind of make them convincing looking. Okay, so when I zoom out, it's really subtle, but you can see how that little bit of highlight hopefully just gives a little bit of pop of brightness and contrast, making these drips look like they're just standing off a little bit further from the face. If you look at these ones at the top of the forehead versus these ones down here without highlights and shadows, they just look a lot flatter. So hopefully that gives you the idea of how to do those highlights and shadows. You don't have to do highlights on the regular face. Really, the highlights I'm just imagining being the parts where the light is glinting off what I imagine to be this kind of slimy stuff on the face. But if you want to do a couple additional highlights on the regular face, that's your choice. So I'm going to just quickly scroll through, make sure all my layers are named. I don't have any like layer 1 or untitled or anything like that. And I'm going to show you how to go through and just save up your final versions of all of these files now that we're pretty much done. You're going to want to make sure that you still go through and do the highlights and shadows on all of your drips, but for the demo, I just want to do a small part so you could see those skills at work. Get rid of these arrows. Okay, so I've assumed that I've done all the highlights and shadows on all my drips and the face that I want to do. I'm going to do a Control S just to update my regular file. And that is just like making a checkpoint in the file you've been working on the whole time. It's the same file. You don't have to make new saves every single time. But by doing Control S, you're updating that file that you have saved to be the latest version of what you've done and what you've worked on and added to that file. So this is fine. My PSD, I don't have to do anything else to this. But there's two more files we have to save. So the first thing we're going to do is go to File, Save As this time because we're saving this file as a different type of file, or saving this image as a different type of file. All you have to save, as long as you have the name of your Photoshop document correct, the only thing you have to change is the Save As type. So where it says Photoshop, now we're going to click on that, just like we did with the real life doodles and any of our other practices. We're going to go to the Save As type and choose the first JPEG option. So there's three, you just pick the top one, click on that, and then click Save. This, when it pops up, you can just click OK. It's up to you if you want to change the quality to maximum. It does make the file size a little bit larger, but if you really want to save this in high quality to turn into an art show or print out later, you're welcome to turn that to maximum. But high and maximum, there's not a whole lot of difference as far as like what we can recognize. So just click OK if you want when that pops up. So now we've got our PSD and our JPEG that we just saved. The last thing we have to do is save a screenshot of all of these layers. So I'm going to pull out my layers panel by clicking on the name layers and dragging over to the left. And that way I can expand the layers panel to show every layer that I have. You might be able to have all of your layers show up without having to pull this panel out. It's just because of my resolution while I'm doing a demo that everything on here is a lot larger than it normally would be. So you might not have to pull your layers panel out, but just in case you do and need more space, remember that you can change the size of your panels by dragging on, the top and bottom of them, or you can pull a panel out and expand it that way. Bottom line is I want to be able to see every single one of your layers that you use to make, this effect on your portrait. If you have a lot of layers, you might have to really expand it. I want to be able to see your 2 copies of your portrait photo, all of the color that you added to the face, as well as your outlines. And I would make sure that the layers that you want to be locked are locked, and that every single layer has a name. So once I pulled my layers panel out, I can see my work. I might even scroll over so I can see that more next to my layers panel. I'm going to show you how to save a screenshot. So click on your Start menu, and you're going to scroll down until you see Windows Accessories. If for some reason when you click the Start menu, all of these things are grayed out, you just have to close it and click it again, and they should be white and clickable at that point. So again, we're scrolling down to Windows Accessories, click on the drop down, and you're going to look for the Snipping Tool. So click on that, and that's going to pull up this little panel of options. You want to click on New, and that's going to allow you to make a new screenshot. All I really want is your workspace that shows your actual piece and your layers. But if you want to do all of your screen showing including your clock and the date, you're welcome to do that. It's up to you. But remember, what I need to be able to see is your work, like the actual portrait, right next to your layers so that I can see what layers you used. So once you've gotten that, you can let go. And then click on, this is a floppy disk. I don't know if you guys know what these are, but this was pretty much what people used to save their work to. So it's become the universal symbol for save. So you're going to click on the little floppy disk icon to save your snip or your screen capture. And you are going to want to save it to the same place you have your other Grime art files saved to. So that should hopefully be in your H drive. And you're going to go to whatever folder you have all of these in. For me, I have a ton of folders. So I'm going to save it in the same place that my other files are. None of those other files are showing up, but that's because of the type of file that the snipping program automatically saves in. So when you have a file type chosen, I don't know why it works like this, but it only shows you other type or other files that are the same type of file. So since I don't have any PNGs saved yet, it's not showing me my other files that I have in there. You can change it to a JPEG if you want, and then see it's going to show you where you have other JPEGs saved all of that is to just say, don't be alarmed if you go into that folder and you're like, oh my gosh, all my other files are not there. They're there. It's just not showing you them. But saving it as a PNG is fine. That's totally cool with me. But just make sure that you change the name, everything in front of the period, to the same as your other stuff. So last name, first initial, underscore Grime. But then at the end, you're going to add SS. And that lets me know that this is your screenshot. So make sure that you've got the SS at the end and then click save. And I'm going to show you all three of these files next to each other. So I'm going to close my snipping tool. I don't see the little asterisk up here in my top tab for this file. So that means there are no unsaved changes. I have saved recently and I can close Photoshop. Then if I go to my H drive, I can show you all the files that we should have when you're finished with the project. Okay, so I have my PSD, where if I open that, it's going to bring me to the file we were just working in with all our layers and our panels and all that good stuff, because that's a Photoshop document. So this is a good thing for you to just double check that everything works before you turn them in and are finished with the project. Just open each file and make sure that the right thing opens and that it's not corrupted or anything weird. So here's my Photoshop document. The next one is my JPEG, and that's just the flattened final image version of what I created in Photoshop. So notice there's no panels, no layers, no edits or anything. It's just the image. But JPEG, again, is the universal type of file that can be understood by pretty much any program and opened and viewed. I probably can't open and view your Photoshop documents in Classroom, so that's why I ask you to save both and turn in both. And then lastly, here is our screenshot. So if you open your screenshot, just make sure that all your layers are visible along with your work, and that you have that named correctly. You'll also want to, if you can, turn in the photo that you used for the project. So I don't know why I don't have mine in here. I thought I did. But just turn in the image that you used to, like your portrait photo that you based your grime art off of. So like, for instance, all of these, I also have the image file in there with them as well. So if you could turn that in along with the other 3 files that we saved of your grime art, you should be set. And don't worry if when you turn something in on Google Classroom, you can't see a preview of your Photoshop document. That's normal. Google Classroom is not Photoshop, so it can't really open or usually preview those documents. So as long as it's there, it's named correctly, and you know that when you open it on your computer, it was fine, you're all set. So just make sure you have those 4 files to turn in, and you are good to go. Congrats on finishing your first official Photoshop project, you guys. Nice work.